The crystal chandeliers of the Sapphire Lounge cast a golden, fractured light over the elite of New York's financial district. William Carter watched his beautiful wife, Victoria, holding a crystal wine glass, laughing effortlessly among the firm's partners. They were the perfect Manhattan power couple. But as William approached her from behind a marble pillar, the ambient jazz faded into a sickening silence when he heard her voice, low and devoid of affection, whispering to the handsome man beside her. "William? He's just a prop. Marrying him was my biggest mistake." If you love deep, dark stories of betrayal and the hidden price of ambition, stay tuned and subscribe to the channel. The crystal chandeliers of the Sapphire Lounge cast a fractured, golden glow over the annual Whitmore Capitol Winter Gala. It was a symphony of Manhattan's elite, an atmosphere thick with the scent of aged scotch, Tom Ford cologne, and predatory confidence. At the center of the room, radiating an effortless, magnetic grace, stood Victoria Sterling. William Carter stood near the mahogany bar, nursing a bourbon, his eyes anchored to his wife. After 5 years of marriage, Victoria still possessed the ability to make his pulse falter. She wore a backless emerald gown that moved like liquid against her skin, her dark hair pinned up in a sharp, elegant twist. She was a senior director at the firm, a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions with a chilling smile. To the rest of the room, they were the ultimate power couple, stable, successful, untouchable. William glanced at his watch. It was past midnight. He decided it was time to rescue her from the endless corporate posturing. He set his bourbon down and navigated through the sea of bespoke suits and sparkling diamonds. As he approached the secluded alcove near the terrace doors, the lively jazz band transitioned into a slow, melancholic tune. Victoria was standing by a heavy marble pillar, her back partially turned to the room. She was not talking to a client or a senior partner. She was standing intimately close to Julian St. James, the firm's newest and most aggressive managing director. William slowed his pace, a fond smile forming on his lips as he prepared to slide his hand around her waist. But before he could step out from the shadow of the pillar, the ambient noise of the party seemed to evaporate, isolating her voice. Victoria took a slow sip from her crystal wine glass, leaving a faint crescent of crimson lipstick on the rim. She looked up at Julian, her expression devoid of the polished, diplomatic warmth she reserved for the public. Her eyes were dark, calculating, and heavy with a familiarity that made William's blood turn to ice. "You're overthinking it, Julian," Victoria murmured, her voice a low, husky purr that William hadn't heard in years. Julian leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers. "Am I? He watches you like a hawk, Victoria. It's pathetic. How much longer are we going to play this game?" Victoria sighed, a delicate, exasperated sound. She traced the rim of her wine glass with one perfectly manicured finger. "William is blind. He sees exactly what I allow him to see. A devoted wife. A stable home." She let out a soft, humorless laugh that sent a physical ache through William's chest. "Honestly, marrying him was my biggest mistake. But he's a necessary prop. He provides the wholesome image the board demands." William stopped breathing. The floor beneath him felt as though it had given way, plunging him into a soundless, suffocating vacuum. He stared at the back of his wife's neck, the woman he had loved, protected, and built a life with, as she casually dismantled his entire existence in 2 sentences. Julian's hand slid down to rest on the small of Victoria's back, a possessive, hidden gesture. "A mistake we will rectify soon enough," he whispered. William stepped back into the shadows, his hands trembling so violently he had to clench them into fists. His perfect marriage, his beautiful wife, his entire world, it was all a stage. And the curtain had just been torn down. The ride back to their Tribeca penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. The tinted windows of the chauffeured Lincoln Town car turned the vibrant neon streaks of Manhattan into a blur of cold, smeared light. William sat rigidly against the leather seat, staring at the black partition that separated them from the driver. Beside him, Victoria was a portrait of post-gala exhaustion. She had kicked off her designer heels, tucking her legs beneath the heavy emerald silk of her gown, and rested her head against the headrest. Her eyes were closed, her breathing perfectly even. To anyone else, she looked like a hard-working executive finding a well-deserved moment of peace. To William, she looked like an absolute stranger. The lingering scent of her expensive perfume, which had once felt comforting and familiar, now settled in his throat like dry ash. "You were unusually quiet during the closing speech," Victoria murmured, her eyes still shut. Her voice was smooth, carrying none of the jagged, cruel edge he had heard in the alcove. William swallowed the heavy knot of nausea rising in his chest. "I heard you," he wanted to scream. I heard you call our marriage your biggest mistake. Instead, he forced his hands to uncurl from the armrest. He needed to know how deep the performance went. "Just tired," William lied, fighting to keep his tone level. "It seemed like a highly successful night for Whitmore Capital. I saw you speaking with Julian St. James near the terrace. He seems intensely invested in your division." Victoria's eyes opened slowly. The rhythmic passing of streetlights illuminated the sharp, calculated intelligence in her dark gaze. She didn't flinch. Not a single muscle in her delicate face betrayed panic or guilt. "Julian is incredibly ambitious," she replied, her tone effortlessly dismissive. She reached over, her cool, soft fingers lightly brushing against the back of his hand. William had to command every nerve in his body not to pull away from her touch. He's eager to prove himself to the senior partners. He lacks nuance, though. A bit too aggressive for my taste. He seemed very comfortable with you. William pressed softly, turning his head to look directly into her eyes, searching for a crack in the armor. Almost familiar. For a microsecond, a shadow crossed Victoria's expression, a subtle tightening of her jaw, a brief, unnatural stillness. Then, she smiled. It was the same brilliant, practiced smile she used to disarm hostile shareholders in the boardroom. "We work closely on the European portfolio, William," she said gently, giving his hand a seemingly affectionate squeeze. "You know how these corporate climbers are. They latch onto whoever can elevate their status. It's purely transactional." She withdrew her hand to check a vibrating notification on her phone, subtly angling the screen away from his line of sight. The casual grace with which she delivered the lie terrified him more than the betrayal itself. She wasn't just hiding an affair, she was expertly managing him. She was managing his perception of reality. "Transactional," William echoed quietly, turning his gaze back to the rain-streaked window. "Right." The toxic seed of doubt had fully blossomed into a chilling certainty. He was trapped in a war he hadn't known had started, against an opponent who slept beside him every night. To survive this, he would have to become just as cold. The Tribeca penthouse was submerged in the heavy, breathless silence of 3 in the morning. In the master bedroom, Victoria's breathing was a steady, rhythmic metronome. William lay awake beside her, staring at the shifting shadows on the vaulted ceiling. The ghost of her words at the gala echoed endlessly in his mind. My biggest mistake. He carefully slid out from under the Egyptian cotton sheets, his bare feet making no sound against the cold hardwood floor. He walked down the darkened hallway toward the west wing of the apartment. Victoria's home office was her sanctuary, a room strictly off-limits to everyone, including him. It was where she finalized Whitmore Capital's most sensitive acquisitions. The heavy oak door was locked, as always. William stood before it, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Finding a way into her private domain meant crossing a line from which there was no return. It was the absolute death of trust. But trust, he realized with a bitter swallow, was already a rotting corpse in their marriage. He reached up to the top molding of the doorframe, his fingers brushing against a thin layer of dust until they grazed the small, metallic coldness of the spare key. She had hidden it there years ago, mentioning it once in passing and clearly forgetting he remembered. He slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded deafening in the quiet apartment. The office was immaculate. Moonlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating her sleek glass desk and the closed silver laptop resting upon it. William sat in her high-backed leather chair, the faint scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air. He opened the laptop. The password prompt glowed sharply in the dark. He tried their anniversary. Incorrect. He tried her birthday. Incorrect. He paused, visualizing the woman he had observed at the gala, the calculating, ruthlessly ambitious director. He typed in the name of the ultimate position she craved, Whitmore partner. The screen unlocked instantly. The sheer predictability of her ambition stung worse than a physical blow. William bypassed her secure work emails, diving straight into her personal calendar. At first glance, it was a tedious mosaic of board meetings, conference calls, and European market reviews. But when he accessed the archived and deleted folders, the meticulously crafted facade began to crumble. He found a string of deleted calendar invites spanning the last 8 months. Asterisk client consultation, Zurich. Portfolio review, London. Strategy alignment, Paris. Asterisk he pulled out his own phone and cross-referenced the dates with Whitmore Capital's public press releases regarding Julian St. James's travel schedule. They matched perfectly. Every time Julian had flown to Europe for an acquisition, Victoria had discreetly booked a flight to the same city under the guise of independent client meetings. But it wasn't just the international trips. William's eyes narrowed as he noticed a recurring entry every Thursday afternoon, hidden under the vague label of Private Wealth Seminar. There was no location attached to the main file, but deep within the event's metadata, a geographical coordinate remained undeleted. It wasn't a corporate building or a restaurant. It was the exact address of the Sterling Building, an ultra-exclusive residential high-rise where Julian maintained a private suite. And the very next entry was scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Thursday, 1:45 p.m. The sky over Manhattan was the color of bruised iron, threatening a downpour that perfectly matched the cold weight settling in William's chest. He sat in the driver's seat of an inconspicuous, rented sedan parked halfway down the block from the Sterling Building. The brass-gilded entrance of the ultra-exclusive residential high-rise gleamed dully under the dim afternoon light. That morning, Victoria had kissed his cheek over coffee, her voice laced with manufactured exhaustion as she complained about a tedious afternoon of compliance seminars. Now, William waited in the freezing car, the engine cut off, his eyes fixed on the revolving doors. At exactly 1:55 p.m., a black town car pulled to the curb. Victoria stepped out, shielded by a dark charcoal trench coat, a sleek designer tote slung over her shoulder. William watched her through the windshield, his breath lightly fogging the glass. Her posture, usually a rigid monument to corporate perfection when she was with him, shifted entirely. She looked relaxed, fluid, and dangerously alive. Less than 2 minutes later, Julian St. James emerged from an adjacent luxury coffee shop. William's hands tightened around the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He forced his eyes to stay open. He needed to witness every second of the destruction of his life. Julian approached her with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he owned the city. He did not offer a polite, professional greeting. Instead, he seamlessly slipped his hand beneath the open flap of Victoria's trench coat, his fingers resting on the curve of her waist with the effortless muscle memory of a seasoned lover. Victoria leaned into the touch, tilting her chin up to accept a lingering kiss against her jawline. The physical confirmation of the infidelity was a jagged blade twisting in William's gut. Yet, it was the sequence that followed that truly froze the blood in his veins. Stepping back, Victoria reached into her heavy tote bag. She did not pull out a room key or a bottle of champagne. She withdrew a thick, sealed dossier, the silver crest of Whitmore Capital clearly stamped on the front cover. She handed it to Julian, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, calculating intensity that belonged in a boardroom, not a lover's rendezvous. Julian traced the edge of the highly confidential folder, giving her a conspiratorial smirk before resting his hand on the small of her back to guide her inside. As they disappeared into the opulent, shadowed lobby, heading toward the private elevator banks, William slowly lowered his hands from the wheel. The agonizing truth finally began to crystallize. The afternoon meeting was not merely an escape from a stale marriage. The casual exchange of that restricted dossier suggested something far more sinister. He wasn't just dealing with a cheating wife. He was entangled with a woman executing a ruthless, meticulously calculated master plan, and he was nothing but a blind pawn on her chessboard. Friday evening, the atmosphere at Harborview Restaurant was dense with the hushed, expensive hum of corporate heavyweights dining by the water. William sat across from Victoria, a single taper candle casting dancing shadows across her porcelain features. She looked breathtaking, as she always did when performing the role of the devoted wife. To the casual observer, they were the pinnacle of success, clinking crystal glasses over a plate of imported sea bass. To William, the table felt like an interrogation room bathed in soft lighting. Megan Taylor, a junior partner at Whitmore Capital, and her husband, Brian Cooper, sat adjacent to them. The conversation flowed effortlessly from market trends to upcoming European acquisitions, a safe, polished terrain where Victoria thrived. William, however, was tired of safe terrain. He took a slow sip of his Cabernet, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "The European market is certainly volatile," William interjected smoothly, seamlessly slipping into the corporate banter. Speaking of volatility, Victoria mentioned that Julian St. James has been aggressive in his tactics. The silence that followed was infinitesimal, lasting less than a heartbeat, but William caught it. Victoria's knife paused over her fish. Megan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of professional curiosity crossing her expression. Brian simply nodded, swirling his wine. "He is," Victoria replied, her voice cool, modulated, entirely professional. She resumed cutting her meal. "He pushes boundaries. Sometimes a necessary evil in our line of work, though exhausting to manage." "It must be," William continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an edge that only Victoria would recognize. "It's a demanding relationship to balance, especially when the boundaries between personal ambition and corporate loyalty blur." Victoria's dark eyes snapped up to meet his. The ambient light caught a sudden, sharp coldness in her gaze. She held his stare, her expression perfectly composed, but the micromuscle tightening in her jaw betrayed her. He had struck a nerve. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, William," she said, her tone deceptively light, a silken thread pulled dangerously taut. "Julian is a colleague. Our loyalty is to the firm exclusively." "Of course," William smiled, a chillingly pleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. "I just meant that ambition can make people careless. They start taking risks they wouldn't normally take, forgetting who is watching." He paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy with unspoken accusations. "For example, those private wealth seminars you've been attending at the Sterling Building. They seem highly intense. Thursday afternoons must be draining." Victoria's hand gripped the stem of her wine glass, her knuckles flashing white against the crystal. The blood seemed to drain from her face for a fraction of a second, her pupils dilating in sudden, unmistakable alarm. She blinked, the mask snapping back into place almost instantly, but the damage was done. William had seen the terror. "They are intensive," Victoria managed, her voice suddenly slightly hoarse. She quickly took a sip of water, carefully avoiding William's piercing gaze. "But necessary for the new portfolio." Megan, oblivious to the silent warfare across the table, chimed in. "I didn't realize Julian was involved in those seminars, Victoria. That's outside his usual scope, isn't it?" Victoria offered a thin, brittle smile. "He's trying to expand his horizons, Megan. That's all." William leaned back in his chair, a cold satisfaction settling in his stomach. The crack in the ice had widened. She was slipping, and the desperation in her carefully constructed defense confirmed his deepest fears. The affair was only the beginning. The lies were structural, and he was about to tear the whole building down. The Tribeca penthouse was submerged in the heavy, breathless silence of a Sunday afternoon while Victoria was reviewing client files at a luxury spa. William stood in the center of her home office, staring at a blank stretch of wall behind an abstract painting. He had noticed a slight discoloration on the edge of the frame weeks ago, dismissing it as dust. Today he slid the painting to the side, revealing a flush, state-of-the-art keypad safe embedded in the plaster. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. He didn't need to guess the code this time. It wouldn't be anything sentimental. He thought of her ultimate ambition, the one thing she valued above everything else. He carefully typed in the date of her final interview for senior director at Whitmore Capital, the day she had first met Julian St. James. The green light flared silently. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside the safe were a few velvet jewelry boxes, stacks of foreign currency, and a thick, leather-bound dossier. It was not a client file or a financial report. The cover was devoid of any corporate logo. It simply read, *Strategic Alliance, Carter Initialization. William's hands trembled violently as he pulled the heavy folder into the center of the room. He sat on the floor, the cold hardwood seeping into his bones, and opened the first page. It was a premarital psychological and financial profile. On him, the first section meticulously detailed William's background, his family's impeccable, albeit quiet, social standing, and his clean, scandal-free career in corporate law. There were bullet points highlighting his malleable nature, his loyalty, and his ideal presentation for a stabilizing domestic image. As he turned the pages, the breath caught in his throat, a sharp, ragged sound tearing from his chest. There were projected timelines mapping out their courtship, engagement, and wedding, synchronized flawlessly with Victoria's promotion tracks at Whitmore. The dossier outlined how his stable, respectable presence would counterbalance her aggressive, sometimes ruthless reputation within the firm, specifically to appease the conservative board of directors. And then, he found the communication logs. In the back of the dossier were printed emails exchanged between Victoria and Julian St. James, dating back to before he had even proposed. Julian's name was listed as strategic advisor. "He's the perfect camouflage," Julian read an email dated 3 months before their wedding. "The board thinks I'm a flight risk. A solid, boring husband like William Carter secures my image. Once the senior partnership is finalized, we initiate the dissolution phase. The prenup is ironclad." "Agreed," Julian had replied. Maintain the illusion. We need the leverage." William dropped the file, the thick pages spilling across the floor like a scattered deck of marked cards. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't an affair born of passion or a moment of weakness. It was a cold, calculated business transaction. His entire marriage, every smile, every touch, every whispered word of love, it was all a grotesque, meticulously scripted performance. He had been selected, evaluated, and utilized as a human shield for her ambition. He was the biggest mistake because he was the only variable she couldn't entirely control, the prop that had suddenly opened its eyes. The devastating truth crystallized with agonizing clarity. Victoria had never loved him. She had only invested in him. And now, the dissolution phase was about to begin on his terms. Monday morning, the heavy glass doors of Whitmore Capital's executive boardroom slammed shut with a finality that echoed off the mahogany paneling. The air inside was dense, charged with the quiet intensity of a quarterly review. Victoria sat at the head of the long table, a portrait of impenetrable ambition. She was presenting the European portfolio strategy, her voice a smooth, commanding presence that commanded the attention of the senior partners. Julian St. James sat to her right, his aggressive posture a perfect complement to her polished delivery. William Carter stood in the shadow of the doorway, his presence uninvited and utterly unexpected. He was not a partner. He was a corporate lawyer at an entirely different firm, a man the board only knew as the stabilizing force behind their star director. He gripped a thick, silver-embossed folder in his left hand. The leather strap of his briefcase dug into his shoulder, anchoring him against the suffocating rush of adrenaline. As Victoria concluded her opening remarks on the Zurich acquisition, her eyes swept the room and landed on him. The presentation remote slipped slightly in her hand. For a microsecond, the immaculate facade cracked, revealing a flicker of sheer terror. Julian's head snapped up, his arrogant smirk evaporating instantly. "William," Victoria said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, tight with controlled panic. This is a closed session. We are in the middle of a board review. I am aware, Victoria, William replied, his voice calm, echoing clearly in the silence. He stepped fully into the room, walking deliberately toward the head of the table. He did not look at Julian. He kept his eyes locked on the woman who had spent 5 years orchestrating his reality. But considering the foundation of this portfolio is built on a fraud that directly involves me, I thought my presence was necessary. A murmur rippled through the senior partners. The chairman, an older, formidable man with cold gray eyes, leaned forward. Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular. What fraud are you referring to? William reached the edge of the table and placed the heavy dossier down with a dull thud. He slid it across the polished mahogany toward the chairman. I am referring to the Strategic Alliance, Carter Initialization Document, a comprehensive plan detailing the fraudulent foundation of my marriage to Victoria Sterling, specifically designed to secure her position and manipulate this board's perception of her stability. Victoria stood up so quickly her heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floor. William, stop this. You don't know what you're doing. This is absurd. Her voice was high, shrill, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. She reached across the table, desperately trying to grab the folder, but the chairman placed a heavy hand over it. It is not absurd, Victoria, William continued, his voice steady, devoid of the rage he had felt for days. It is meticulously documented. The file contains internal communications between Victoria and Julian St. James, dating back years. It details how my presence was used as leverage to secure the senior partnership she is currently pitching for. Furthermore, it outlines how they utilized their private wealth seminars at the Sterling Building to coordinate confidential acquisitions outside of the firm's purview. Julian finally found his voice, standing up, his face flushed with a dark, ugly anger. This is a complete fabrication. He's a jealous, unstable husband making wild accusations because his wife is more successful than him. The metadata on the emails, William said smoothly, addressing the chairman, will confirm their authenticity, as will the geographical coordinates embedded in Victoria's calendar, matching Julian's private suite. They haven't just been lying to me. They have been orchestrating unauthorized deals and using my marriage as a smokescreen to bypass the board's ethical compliance. The chairman slowly opened the folder. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of heavy paper as he flipped through the psychological profile, the timelines, and the printed emails. The color drained from the older man's face, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. Victoria sank back into her chair, her hands trembling violently in her lap. The emerald dress she wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The power, the ambition, the impenetrable armor she had worn for years, it was all dissolving under the cold, harsh light of the boardroom. Victoria, the chairman said softly, his voice colder than winter steel. You and Julian will remain in this room. Everyone else is dismissed. Security will be escorting you both out of the building pending a full forensic investigation. William didn't stay to watch the fallout. He turned his back on the wreckage, the sound of Victoria's desperate, pleading voice echoing behind him as he walked out the heavy glass doors, the burden of the lie finally lifting from his shoulders. The Tribeca penthouse was wrapped in a suffocating twilight when Victoria finally returned. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, a city that had been her kingdom only hours before. Now, the lights below seemed distant, indifferent to the absolute collapse of her empire. William was waiting in the living room. He sat in the low-slung leather armchair, a single, dim lamp casting long shadows across the immaculate space. He had packed 2 suitcases, his entire life distilled into a handful of essentials. He wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, a sharp contrast to the tailored suits she had always demanded he wear for the sake of appearances. The heavy front door clicked open, and Victoria stepped inside. The transformation was startling. The emerald silk and the predatory confidence were gone. Her dark hair was messy, her posture defeated. She looked small, hollowed out by the sheer force of the board's immediate termination and the impending forensic audit that would likely result in criminal charges for corporate espionage. She stopped in the center of the room, her eyes locking onto the suitcases near the door, then slowly traveling to William. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic below. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice a fragile, raspy thread. It lacked the smooth, commanding resonance he was used to. It sounded broken. "No, Victoria," William replied quietly, his tone devoid of malice or triumph. It was the calm of a man standing amidst the ashes of a house that had never been his home. "You destroyed it. The moment you decided my life was a line item on your resume." She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, a defensive gesture that looked painfully inadequate. "You don't understand how this city works, William. You never did. You have to be ruthless to survive. Survival is one thing," he said, standing up slowly. "Building a marriage on a calculated, fraudulent profile, using me as a human shield for your ambition, that's not survival. That's pathology." Victoria flinched, a genuine flicker of pain crossing her features. "I didn't hate you, William. I was comfortable with you." The confession was worse than the lie. It was a sterile, transactional truth that perfectly encapsulated the woman she was. He had been a comfortable investment, a low-risk asset in her portfolio. William walked toward the sleek glass coffee table in the center of the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring, a heavy, platinum band that had felt like a shackle for the past few weeks. The metal was cold against his palm. He looked down at it, the symbol of a vow that had only ever been a business strategy. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology he knew would be empty. The rage had burned itself out, leaving only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had played his final move, and the game was over. William placed the ring down on the glass surface. The soft clink of the platinum echoed loudly in the silent, expensive tomb of their marriage. He picked up his suitcases, not looking back at the woman standing in the shadows, her life unraveling in the dark. He walked toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the cold brass handle before he opened it to the hallway. "The contract is over, Victoria," William said softly, his voice steady as he stepped across the threshold. "And so are we."